Hello and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. We are in the home stretch of this show, the second to last segment, and it should be a very exciting one. We are done with ESPN's PPR League rankings. We did the defense, and now we are going to look at some breakout fantasy players in the NFL. Now, these are some names that I may have highlighted when I did some previous rankings of ESPN's skill position players, and some of these players may not have been highlighted as often, but these are a couple of players that I think can be heavily effective come the start of the fantasy football season. I think that some of these players are coming off injury. Some of these players have not had good play from other skill positions that may benefit their output, but ultimately these are a group of players that you should look to grab come a fantasy draft time. We will start off in the AFC East with the New York Jets, and this player might shock some because he definitely doesn't seem like a breakout athlete, but when you add a quarterback who did not play as much last season, I think this guy will fall into even more superstardom levels, and that is Garrett Wilson. Consider this. Garrett Wilson has had back-to-back over 1,000-yard seasons, 178 catches to his name, and his quarterbacks were Zach Wilson, Tim Boyle, and Trevor Siemian. That is an incredible stat for any young rookie to have. Even coming into this league, obviously we knew that Garrett Wilson could be a star coming out of Ohio State, but ultimately he's never had that quarterback production to back up his style of play, and Aaron Rodgers coming in off that Achilles tear this year could vault him into superstardom. Now, it's quite an easy kind of assumption to think that Aaron Rodgers will elevate his game, but we can't push all our chickens into one basket because Aaron Rodgers is obviously older. He's 40 years old going into the season. Now, I just think that doesn't go against Garrett Wilson because of the fact that he's already had that level of production with much worse quarterback play. So that is why I think that Garrett Wilson will have an even huger season. Look for him to be one of the number one targets that Aaron Rodgers will go to come next year. Obviously, we'll have to see how Aaron Rodgers plays next year and if he wants to incorporate more of his guys who came in from the Packers into this offense. Obviously, Allen Lazard is still there, but ultimately, you can't overlook a guy like Garrett Wilson because of the insane statistics he put up in an offense that heavily underperformed due to their quarterback play. So he is one of my number one breakout fantasy athletes for next year. Coming in at the second spot that I want to talk about, another player who is kind of seen as an up-and-comer in this league in terms of fantasy. I think that he will be a great fantasy athlete for years to come for you guys. He should be a highly coveted asset later in the fantasy drafts as a quarterback, and that is Anthony Richardson of the Indianapolis Colts. Obviously, we were robbed of his rookie season, but in the games that he played, the Colts offense shined. They scored 26 points in the games that he played and only 13 in the 11 games that he did not. In 4 games, he scored over 20-plus fantasy points. So obviously, Anthony Richardson is looking to be one of the better fantasy quarterbacks next year in the NFL. This is his second year, obviously. He's going to be a little bit overlooked in that division. I think that C.J. Stroud had the benefit of playing a full year, and he's highly going to be coveted next year in terms of fantasy. But Anthony Richardson is a guy to look out for in that division. I think he's the second best quarterback in that division. I'm going to say it. I think that Trevor Lawrence is regressing. Obviously, Will Levis has not had that much opportunity to play. He could be a solid quarterback, but I just haven't seen enough out of him. But Anthony Richardson, I think that in Shane Steichen's system in his second year, fully healthy, expect Anthony Richardson to be a huge fantasy point getter. I think anyone picking him up in the latter stages of fantasy drafts is a lucky guy because of the fact that Anthony Richardson, in the games that we have seen him play, has scored so many fantasy points, 20 plus in 4 games that he has played. And the Colts offense has skyrocketed because of him. So look for Anthony Richardson to be another breakout athlete in a full season, hopefully, for him. Coming in at number 3, a player who a lot of people expected to break out early on in his career, but also did not benefit from good quarterback play. This year, he finally gets that. It is Drake London. Drake London, in the Desmond Ridder, Arthur Smith era, obviously did not break out. He has been a player who has been much maligned because of the fact that a lot of people expected him to come into this league running, and he just hasn't. He's only had 62.1% of the targets in the years he's been in the NFL. But enter Kirk Cousins for him, and suddenly this Falcons offense becomes very hopeful, especially for a guy like Drake London, who is viewed as the number 1 wide receiver. Obviously, we'll have to see how Raheem Morris's offensive scheme works. We know he's a more defensive-minded coach, but overall, I feel that he's not going to be as limited as he was in Arthur Smith's system. I think that the addition of Kirk Cousins gives more opportunity for Drake London to shift his role, whether it be outside or the slot. I think that Drake London can get a lot more game action, a lot more targets, and that target usage rate will skyrocket for him. I think that overall this Falcons offense is going to be very exciting as well. A couple of players are going to be top 10 players in their respective positions. I don't think Drake London is quite there yet, because obviously you still have guys like Kyle Pitts and Bijan Robinson who still want to be incorporated into this offense. But ultimately, I still think Drake London is going to have a huge year. I think he's going to have over 1,000 yards with Kirk Cousins. Obviously, Kirk Cousins has some great receivers, so he knows how to elevate their play. So Drake London is one of the players to look out for as a breakout fantasy athlete. I don't expect him to go very early in fantasy drafts, so if you're looking for someone later in rounds, he's going to be your guy. Now, last but not least, we talked about this team a little bit when I was talking about Will Levis and how he's going to look in terms of fantasy. We're going to transition to his running back, Tyjae Spears. Last year, he had 4.53 yards per carry for the Tennessee Titans last year. But ultimately, I'm looking at Tyjae Spears as a guy who needs to help Will Levis. Obviously, Will Levis does have a very exciting wide receiver core, very experienced wide receiver core. They brought in DeAndre Hopkins last year. They bring in Calvin Ridley from Jacksonville this year. I think that Tennessee is going to have a very interesting wide receiver core, but it all depends on Will Levis. If Will Levis performs to the levels he is expected to, he's had some great games last year, showing some toughness, some moxie, but ultimately it's all going to start with the run game. He's going to have to hand it off to Tyjae Spears in order to elevate the wide receivers around him, and ultimately that will translate into Tyjae Spears' stats. Right now, I kind of view him as an RB4. I don't think he's going to be that high a level. There are still guys above him who I expect to have much better production. But ultimately, Tyjae Spears is seen as one of those young guys who can help Will Levis progress in the Tennessee Titans system. Obviously, they bring in Brian Callahan as their head coach, an offensive-minded coach who's going to want to elevate Levis's play, and he's going to have to do that by implementing Tyjae Spears as well into the system. In his second year, Tyjae Spears, look for him to be a breakout fantasy athlete. That should just about do it for this segment. Coming up in the last segment of my show, we are going to have a special segment. Should the Mavs win tonight, we are going to take a look at the potential NBA Finals odds and what it means for a Celtics-Mavs series. So we will be right back with